In Norway, if you want to know exactly how much money your neighbor makes, your coworker earns, or your child's teacher takes home every year, you can look it up, publicly. It's been this way since 1863. Anyone's total income, total tax paid, and total wealth is available to anyone else who wants to see it. No court order required, just a login. Most people hearing that for the first time find it shocking, almost invasive. Most Norwegians find it completely unremarkable. And the reason for that gap isn't really about tax policy at all. It's about something much bigger, a psychological trait running underneath an entire region that quietly protects people from a kind of anxiety most of the rest of the world lives with constantly, usually without even noticing it's there. Real quick, before we get into it, if you're the kind of person who enjoys this sort of thing, following the channel genuinely helps and takes about 2 seconds. So today, why Nordic people, broadly, across Sweden, Norway, Denmark, and Finland, tend not to compare themselves to others the way most cultures do, where that trait actually comes from, and what happens, psychologically, when a whole society stops running that comparison loop constantly in the background. Let's start with the name behind it, because there's an actual name for this. Janteloven, the Law of Jante. It comes from a 1933 satirical novel by a Danish-Norwegian author named Aksel Sandemose, describing a fictional small town called Jante, governed by 10 unwritten social rules. You are not to think you are anything special. You are not to think you are as good as we are. You are not to think you are smarter than we are. You are not to think you are more important than we are. Sandemose meant it as a critique, a mockery of small-town conformity crushing individual ambition. But the description resonated so strongly across the region that it stopped being satire and became something closer to an actual, working description of how status and comparison are handled, generation after generation, whether or not anyone involved has ever read the book it came from. There's a specific psychological mechanism worth naming here, because Janteloven isn't just a vague cultural vibe. Psychologists have a formal name for the process it interrupts. Social comparison theory, first described by a psychologist named Leon Festinger back in 1954, describes a basic human tendency to evaluate our own worth, abilities, and progress by measuring ourselves against other people, rather than against any fixed, independent standard. Festinger's original research treated this as a normal, even useful human process, a way of calibrating self-assessment when no objective measuring stick exists. What later research has shown, though, is that this comparison process has a specific failure mode. Compare upward too often, against people who appear to have more, achieve more, or look happier, and the result isn't motivation. It's a steady erosion of satisfaction with your own life, regardless of how objectively good that life actually is. This is where the Norwegian tax transparency example actually connects back to Janteloven in a fairly direct way. One of the arguments Norwegians themselves give for keeping tax records public is that hidden information breeds suspicion and status anxiety, while open information removes the mystery entirely. If everyone can already see roughly what everyone else earns, there's very little social currency left in trying to appear wealthier than you actually are, and very little anxiety generated by wondering whether the person next to you is secretly doing much better. The comparison, instead of running constantly and invisibly in the background, gets settled, plainly, in a public database, and then, largely, stops mattering. Compare that to a culture where income, achievement, and status are kept deliberately private, visible only through curated signals, a car, a house, a vacation photo, a job title. In that environment, social comparison has nothing solid to measure against. So it fills the gap with guesswork and inference, constantly, based on whatever fragments of other people's lives happen to be visible. That's a genuinely less stable foundation for self-assessment than simply knowing the real numbers and being done with it. Quick break, this is the ad part. Since we're talking about comparison today, here's the honest version of this. This video gives you the why Janteloven exists, why the comparison loop works the way it does. What it can't give you is the actual tool to interrupt that loop in your own daily life. That's what the Scandinavian Reset is. 10 separate modules, not just decluttering. A conscious spending worksheet that catches exactly the kind of comparison-driven purchase we've been talking about. A Huga module that costs you nothing. Work-life boundary templates. A full life audit. A room-by-room home reset. A weekly cleaning system. Morning and evening routines. A meal planner. An outdoor time challenge. And a full 30-day plan tying it all together. 60 pages, 25 worksheets, $19.95 during launch, $34.95 after. Links in the pinned comment, or you can get it directly at www.scandinaviansecrets.shop. Back to the video. Back to the psychology, and specifically to what's happened to social comparison in the age of the smartphone, because this is where the contrast with Janteloven becomes almost impossible to ignore. Social media platforms are, structurally, comparison-generating machines. A feed exists specifically to show you curated highlights from other people's lives, on a loop, indefinitely, with no equivalent feed showing you their private struggles, failures, or ordinary boring Tuesdays. Researchers studying social media use have found consistent associations between heavy use and lower self-esteem, particularly around appearance and lifestyle comparison, especially among younger users. This isn't really a new psychological phenomenon. It's Festinger's social comparison process from 1954, running at a volume and frequency the human brain was never built to handle, fed by images specifically selected, filtered, and captioned, to maximize exactly the kind of upward comparison that erodes satisfaction the fastest. A culture organized around Janteloven has, almost by accident, built a kind of structural resistance to this specific failure mode. Not because Scandinavians don't use social media, they do, at rates comparable to most of the developed world. But because the underlying cultural instinct, don't think you're special, don't think you're better, doesn't just apply to how you treat other people. It applies to how much weight you're willing to give a stranger's curated highlight reel in the first place. If the entire culture is quietly skeptical of anyone performing superiority, that skepticism extends naturally to a screen full of people doing exactly that, whether they mean to or not. It's worth being honest about the limits of this, though, because Janteloven isn't a magic shield, and it isn't universally beloved even within the culture it describes. Some Scandinavians, particularly younger generations and people in competitive or entrepreneurial fields, describe it as genuinely limiting, a social pressure that can suppress ambition and make celebrating real achievement feel awkward or even shameful. A symbolic grave marker for Janteloven was actually erected in Norway back in 2005, by people publicly declaring the concept dead and unwelcome, tired of a cultural norm that sometimes punishes success as harshly as it protects against comparison anxiety. It clearly isn't dead, given how visibly it still shapes behavior decades later, but the fact that a culture would stage a mock funeral for one of its own defining values says something honest about how complicated the relationship with it actually is, even from the inside. So the picture here isn't simple, and it shouldn't be presented as simple. Janteloven trades away some individual drive for ambition and personal celebration, in exchange for a population that seems to be measurably more protected from the specific kind of comparison anxiety that erodes satisfaction elsewhere. Neither side of that trade is free, but understanding the trade clearly, rather than just admiring the outcome from a distance, is what actually makes it possible to borrow parts of it deliberately, rather than assuming it's simply a personality trait you either have or don't. The most practical version of this, if you want to actually apply it, isn't moving to Norway or reading a 1933 satirical novel. It's noticing, specifically, when your own sense of how your life is going shifts based on something you just saw about someone else's, and asking whether that shift was based on real information or a curated fragment designed to produce exactly that reaction. Festinger's research suggests the comparison instinct itself can't really be switched off. It's built in, but what you compare against and how much weight you give the result is a lot more adjustable than it feels in the moment a feed loads. If this changed how you think about comparison, following the channel means a lot. It's honestly how something like this grows. And drop your next video idea in the comments. I read every single one, and a lot of what ends up here starts right there. Och som alltid, vi ses nästa gång.